on of the graph, he's not looking for a trend line. What he's interested in is he's noticed that there is an outlier, and this outlier is 7, 7. You see, it's 7 on the x-axis and 7 on the y-axis. And he thinks to himself, why is it that all the other data points follow a pattern that the scientists can understand, but there's one data point that doesn't match, that's unusual? What could have done that? And in our particular scenario, if he's extremely wise, and maybe he has a revelation from the creator of that particular data set, he would discover that the maker of the PowerPoint slide used, yours truly, used the standard original data plots and simply extended them out. The standard ones that come with an Excel, with a PowerPoint, Microsoft PowerPoint chart, extended them out in Excel and added, inserted a row in Excel, 7, 7. It had nothing to do with the rest of the data. It was an exception, and it was added by a personal and intelligent, somewhat intelligent source. And so we have here simply an illustration of the idea that when you have a bunch of data plots that form a trend, that's useful for science. But when you have something that stands outside of the norm, a miracle, that's the realm of Christianity, of religion. And that's what we try to understand as religious people. Not so much the ordinary everyday stuff, that's good for science, but the unusual stuff, the big events. What sort of things am I talking about? Oh yeah, there's the 7. Alright, so for example, we're talking about myths and miracles. So a myth would be, we're interested as religious people in both. A myth would be, for example, Romeo and Juliet. I wanted to use Beowulf, but I figured no one would know what I was talking about. Romeo and Juliet. Okay, this is a myth. It's not a true story, but it teaches a lesson for us about how to get on with people, people who are from a different group or whatever. So that's a good moral lesson. And the form of this myth is in an interesting story. It's a very interesting, engaging story. That's why it's survived to this day, and people keep retelling it. And so, by being an interesting story, it allows the lesson to be able to be taught again and again. Every time someone makes an atrocious remake of it, which is still quite fun to watch. And what's the result? Well, the result is gradual change. People become less tribal because they hear the story and they think to themselves, yeah, that's really sad that those two tribes couldn't get on, and therefore the young people had to suffer. That's really sad. So there's a change. And so myths can be great, but they're not true. And they describe things that are relatively everyday occurrences, and that's where religions tend to get into everyday things in myths, because they want to teach lessons. What about miracles? Well, a miracle is something like even something as mundane as losing your car keys and finding them. So what's the purpose? Well, the purpose is to find your car keys, right? So you lose your car keys, you look everywhere, you're worried sick, and then suddenly you remember to pray, and you pray. When you open your eyes, they're right in front of you on the kitchen table. Okay, you've already looked there 20 times, but wow, here they are. What a miracle. Okay, so the purpose of it is to create a change. If you simply had a thought in your mind, well, life is long, and there's many things in life to enjoy, and I don't really need my car, and I don't really need to go to work today. I guess I can just meditate about the value of if I had my car. That would make no difference. What makes a difference is that the car keys are actually there. You need an actual change to have a miracle. And so it's not an inner change in your thinking, it's an outward change in a reality. What's the form of a miracle? Well, it's an exception to what's normal. If it's normal, then it's not a miracle. In a sense, it's a miracle that the sun rises every morning, or however you want to put that. The Earth spins on its axis. In a sense, that's a miracle, but it happens every day, so we don't really think of that as a miracle. And what's the result? Okay, the result is instant change, or immediate change. It's a sudden change from one state to another state, because the externalities have changed. The outward reality has changed because of this miracle. So let's look at some biblical examples of myths and miracles, because there are some myths in the Bible, if you want to use that word. Water into wine in John chapter 2. So Jesus turning water into wine. Now, is this a myth or a miracle? If it's a myth, does the story make any sense? If it's a myth and Jesus simply gave them an interesting story about once upon a time there was someone who turned water into wine, would that actually make the party have been any better? Not really. People would have still complained that there was no wine, right? Jesus had to literally turn the water into wine for them to be impressed and to say, wow, this wine is even fresher than the slightly fermented stuff you served up last, right? So the water turning into wine has to be a literal external reality, otherwise the story has no meaning. There's no significance to a miracle that didn't actually happen. Calming the sea. Once again, in fact, in this case, this is in Mark 4, by the way. In this case, it can be even more specific. Jesus rebukes them. I think it's in verse 39. Jesus rebukes them, the disciples, because they needed to see a miracle in order to trust him. If all they needed was a myth, then he wouldn't have had to rebuke their lack of faith. So they're out on the sea, and there's a storm, and they think they're going to die, even though the Son of God is in the boat with them. And Jesus is asleep because he knows that they'll be okay, but they don't know they'll be okay. They need an external change. They need an outward change in reality because they lack faith. And so instead of giving them a nice story about how they should have more faith, instead of giving them a myth, Jesus gives them a miracle. He changes the external reality, and that instantly changes the situation for them. So calming of the sea, definitely a miracle. So let's get these up here. Miracle, miracle. And now a myth. The Good Samaritan in Luke 10. This, I say, is a myth because it makes no difference if it was a real story. Okay? So if there was a Good Samaritan that actually did some good things for a guy, that's nice, that's wonderful, but it doesn't change the value of the story. We're constantly hearing about Good Samaritans doing one thing or another, and that's because it's an idea, it's a myth, it's a story that captures many stories, and we can modernize it and we can retell it, and it doesn't lose its power. So this is a story that may have literally happened, but it doesn't need to have literally happened. Therefore, it's a myth. All right, and it teaches us a lesson. It teaches us a moral lesson about how we should help people out even when they don't belong to our group. What about the vine dressers? So the vine dressers is about some people who, let's just put this into a modern context. It's like they're renting a house and they're not paying rent. So the landlord sends the real estate agents and they knock the real estate agents on the head. I'm sure a lot of renters would love to do that. The real estate agents run away, as it were, and the landlord decides to try a different tack. Instead, he sends his son, and the renters, being somewhat stupid, kill the son, thinking that maybe then they'll inherit the house. Instead, of course, the landlord sends in the SWAT team or whatever, sends in the police, and the renters get thrown in jail. So this is a myth. This is a myth. This is a story that we can reinterpret and retell, and it teaches a moral. And the moral is God has sent person after person to try to help people to know him and to have a relationship with him and to find salvation. And the people have mistreated the messengers that God sent. In fact, when God sent his own son, they killed him. And so this was a story, particularly for the religious leaders at the time, to show them that they are not truly as devout and following God as what they think. In fact, if they lived in the days of the prophets, they would have killed the prophets, and the proof of that is that they're going to kill Jesus Christ himself. So it's a powerful story, and it talks about how important it is to really be willing to listen and to hear when God is trying to speak to you, and be willing to change your ways, even when it's not convenient. What about the lost sheep? Now, once again, this story may have actually happened, and it did actually happen in the sense that Jesus came down to search for the lost sheep, which is you and me. But it didn't need to literally have happened. The point is that the idea is that this shepherd cares about his sheep, and therefore he goes and looks for the lost one and bring it back. Even though he has other sheep, he cares about the one that was missing. So he makes all the effort to go and find that lost sheep, and he finds him and brings him back. And it's a beautiful story, which people like to tell in Luke 15. Beautiful story, but once again, it makes no difference if it was true or not. It's a myth. What about the crucifixion? Now, in a sense, I guess it's not a miracle that Jesus could be crucified, but it was a miracle that what would happen when he was crucified, that he would actually take on himself our sins and the punishment for our sins, and that he would literally die and pay that penalty of death that we all deserve. Now, if Jesus did not literally die, as the Muslims believe, then we would not have our sins paid for. We would still have to die for our own sins, which would be a bit of a problem, right? So, is this a myth or a miracle? Well, if it didn't happen, it makes all the difference in the world. It must be a miracle, and it is. So, what about the resurrection? Even more so in this case, right? If Jesus literally died, but didn't literally rise from the dead, we would be worshipping a dead Jew, not a living God, and we may as well become Jews, because that's what the Jews believe, that Jesus was crucified, but he didn't rise from the dead, which would mean that he wasn't God. So once again, resurrection, very important. This is a miracle. What about creation? Is it a myth or a miracle? Let's have a look.